Yes. Hi. Yeah, thank you very much for coming to the 27th Polar Cooperation Research Center International Seminar and 18th Antarctic Study Group Seminar entitled Governing Glacial Geoengineering at the South Pole, the Political and Legal Risks of Ice Sheet Conservation in Antarctica. Thank you very much for coming to the venue at the Kobe University. So the entire seminar, including the latter part of the questions and answers, are video recorded, and some of those videos might be used for YouTube uploading. And thank you very much for your understanding of that. So we'll have about 14 minutes of a presentation from Dr. Flamm, and then followed by 10 minutes each comments from Professor Aoki and myself. Okay, so that's how we are going to proceed. So let me formally introduce to you Professor and Dr. Patrick Flamm, and he is the visiting associate professor at Kobe University under Strategic International Collaboration Grant Type C project. So he's here in Kobe from February 1st to March 15th of 2024. So we are very happy to have him, and he is an international relations scholar, and we are having this very interesting interdisciplinary discussion here at Kobe University. He is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt in Germany. So may I ask Patrick, I think we can call ourselves saying first names, to make his point on this issue. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Akiho.
So, okay, so microphone is on. Thank you.
Yep. And thank you very much, Akiho. Konnichiwa. My name is Patrick Flamm. Thanks for that kind introduction, Akiho, and I'll say a few more words about myself as well. Even though Akiho basically said everything that you need to know for this presentation today. The presentation topic is something that I've been thinking about and working on for a number of months now. I have had some indeed very productive discussions with Akiho in the last few weeks that I have the privilege of being here at Kobe. And yes, this is something that I would like to present to you, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions in the second half of this seminar today. So about myself, I'm an international relations scholar, right? And the discussions that I had with Akiho were interdisciplinary, and this is a way of working that I like to do, especially in this regard, also working with glaciologists, for example, international legal scholars. I think the topic needs to be tackled in an interdisciplinary way. We can all learn a lot from each other, and that's one of the takeaways from my presentation today as well. I'm also a research fellow with the Earth System Governance Project, so this tells you a little bit where I'm coming from with regard to my approach. I also work in the context of critical geopolitics, and as I said before, I have the privilege. I want to thank you again, Akiho, and GSICS for having me here at Kobe. The last few weeks have been very interesting and very productive. So what's the overview of my 40 minutes, my round about 40 minutes? I'll tell you a little bit about the problem here, that is ice sheet collapse, and that then will be in consequent sea level rise. I will introduce you a little bit to this proposed solution of glacial geoengineering, and those parts are descriptive. I will just tell you what it is out there in the literature that people talk about. This will not be my analysis, really. My analysis, and that is informed by discussions that I had with, among others, Akiho Shibata's, is coming in here in points 3 and 4, where I make the case that this governance discourse in this larger glacial geoengineering discourse is really one-sided and needs to be expanded. And I will introduce some understated governance risks as I see them. And I think it's important to acknowledge them more and to talk about them a bit more in this context. Okay, so let me start with that first point, the problem. What is it that glacial geoengineering tries to master, tries to solve? It's about the most at-risk planetary tipping points. I'm sure you're familiar with this concept of planetary tipping points. These are Earth systems that, depending on the emissions pathways that we are on, could be triggered into a collapse, and that be irreversible, at least on human timescales. So this is something that has received a lot of attention in Earth system research, as well as Earth system governance recently. As you can see from that color coding, and I've also highlighted it with these orange circles, on the current emissions pathways that we're on, so 1.5 to 2 degrees here, indicates the level of global warming that is realistic according to the emissions pathways that we're on. And this is where we are on. These Earth systems are at the risk of getting to that tipping point. And as you can see, the ones that are in dark red, they're the ones related to the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenlandic ice sheet. This year, Labrador imminency convection is related to the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation, which is part of the Gulf Stream and which regulates climate in Europe. That's, I think, has been the premise of some Hollywood movies. What would happen if that slows down the Gulf Stream? Europe would freeze over. Okay, so this is a scenario that is looked at by Earth system scientists in that regard as well. I think from the science that I know, we are looking at a slowing down of this Earth system, but what I want to focus on for now is the West Antarctic ice sheet. For obvious reasons, I'm an Antarctic geopolitics expert, and I do not work on Greenland. That's work that others have to do. That's not something that I can do or claim to do as well. Important is that within the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet, there are around 5 to 7 meters of sea level rise, global average. So if the West Antarctic ice sheet or the Greenland ice sheet would collapse, all that ice translated into water, and then sea level rise would result in 5 to 7 meters of sea level rise. That is quite a lot. I mean, we are here in a port city. I mean, you can imagine what 5 to 7 meters would mean for the landscape of Osaka Bay, for example. That would be quite something. This is obviously not happening overnight, but this is something that is, once it's been triggered, it will happen over certain amounts of time. We're looking at hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, but there's nothing that can be done to stop it once this has been triggered. So this is a serious issue. And it's not just serious, it's urgent as well. I said that the time is now up here. We are on emissions pathways where we might get dangerously close to that tipping point. And the scientists who look at this are not certain yet, but it might be that historical emissions are already enough to get us to the tipping point of the West Antarctic ice sheet. So what does that mean? If we stop emitting any CO2 tomorrow, it would still not be enough because of the warming that is already in the ocean, baked into the system. So there is a high degree of urgency here with regard to those most at-risk planetary tipping points. Okay, there's a level of uncertainty. I'm not saying that historical emissions will tip this over. I can't make that assessment. I'm not a glaciologist, but this is something that experts are working on at the moment, but it might be. So it's serious and it's urgent. What are proponents of glacial geoengineering then looking at when they say we need to think about how we can stabilize these ice sheets? They're not actually talking about the whole ice sheet. They're talking in a very targeted way about specific critical glacier systems For the Western Arctic ice sheet, these are the Pine and Thwaites glaciers. You can see that area here enlarged here. And this is not my graphic. This is from one of the papers as well. But the reference will come later on the slides for where you can find this graphic. Oh, well, it's up there, basically. Like, this is a Lockley et al. Paper, 2021, page 404. So they're looking at these critical glacier systems, which are those outlet glaciers through which the ice sheet is flowing into the sea. And these act as plugs, basically. They hold the whole ice sheet back. If these glacier systems would collapse, there would be little to stop the ice sheet below to flow under its own weight into the ocean. There's nothing you can basically do then. It's just gravity. Okay, and so this is what they are targeting. They're not talking about the whole ice sheet, which is massive in the Western Arctic context, and even bigger in the Eastern Arctic ice sheet. In the Eastern Arctic ice sheet, we will talk about enough ice or water to raise global sea levels by 50 meters. That would change the face of the Earth. Really, we can describe it like that. So we're not talking about that yet. We'll talk about this here, and we only talk about these targeted interventions at these critical outlet glaciers, which act as plugs. Okay. So what is that solution then? I told you about the problem. I told you where the approach kind of wants to target the problem. So what does that solution look like? Again, this is the same Lockley paper, 2020, where a number of different ideas are raised. And you probably can't read that back there. But that doesn't matter because these are just different ideas of intervening at the critical glacier. And they have not been, most of them have not been further talked about. What that first really crucial paper, 2018, in Nature by Moore et al. Talks about these three ideas here. One is the proposal to have a pumping station on top of the glacier that extracts the meltwater from the bedrock, pumps it up again and refreezes it, because the meltwater down here acts like a lubricant. And if you take the lubricant away, the glacier will flow slower. That's at least the idea. The second proposal is to buttress the glacial tongue here through an artificial island. And the third idea is to build a berm or wall on the seabed in front of the glacier to stop warm currents to get into this cavity here and melt the glacier tongue at the grounding line from underneath. And that makes the whole glacier unstable. And that final idea, proposal C, is the one that has really attracted the most attention and effort in the last few years. So that scientific community that has formed around these ideas, could we do something like that? How would that look like? Has really focused on this idea here. Initially, the literature spoke about a wall or a berm. Nowadays, the idea that they're putting forward is that of a curtain made from natural fibers. We talk about different materials, and hemp, for example, is one of them. And I have another illustration from the Kiefer et al. Paper, 2023, last year, where they kind of really shows the length at which they've been thinking about how this should look like and how this works and what the pros and cons of these different designs are. And I can just show you that I have no ability to assess that, whether that is a good idea or not. And that's not the point of why I'm standing in front of you. The technical feasibility. This is another map from that same paper, Kiefer et al. 2023, where they show how these curtains, or where those curtains could be built. in the Amundsen Sea embayment. So you have the Thwaites Glacier here, you have Pine Island Glacier here, and this black line here would be an outer boundary building of a curtain, and you see these small black lines here that could be an inner wall that is being built. I highlight this for you in the back row there again with some orange circle. I hope you can see that. What we're talking here about are, in their own words, of those who propose these ideas, around 80-kilometer long curtains fixed to the seabed in some form of foundation. The idea is that these modules would be built in Punta Arenas in Chile and then brought to the Amundsen Sea, where it would be put together and anchored on the seabed. The logistics of that, you can imagine, that would be a massive undertaking, a huge project to do. And they themselves say this is non-trivial with considerable operational risk. So we're really talking about something that is happening on a different scale in many regards. We do not have today any structure that even gets similar to that in the Antarctic. So that would really be something completely new and unprecedented. So that sounds fantastical. And it is. It doesn't exist yet. It's an idea, right? And this is an idea that different scientists from different disciplines as well have been started to flesh out. And it is mostly a scientific discourse, but it's starting to go beyond that. And the example that I can give you, is this novel, The Ministry for the Future. I'm not sure whether you know of this book. If I may just ask you very briefly, by show of hand, whether you know of the book or you have read the book. No one. Wow, interesting. So here comes my reading recommendation. This is not high literature, okay, but it's really interesting. It's a book by a very famous American science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson. And if you don't take it from me, even Barack Obama likes the book. It's a treasure trove of different ideas about how the next couple of decades could unfold in terms of environmental change, technological progress, as well as geopolitical strife. And it's really quite interesting. And within that book, there's a major subplot about glaciologists starting a research experiment in the Antarctic that is glacial geoengineering. It's not the curtain idea, it's the proposal A, the pumping up meltwater and refreezing it idea. And in the novel, the energy that you need to do all the pumping up is radio beamed into the Antarctic from some satellites. And I'm not sure how we are with satellite technology and whether that works, but it's a novel and the writer is allowed to do that, okay? But it's very interesting to just think about. So if you need a book to read that gets you into that kind of mindset, here's a good book to do. Exactly that. So novelists have started to take up the idea, okay? As well as engineering firms. Arco Solutions, the Norwegian Arctic engineering firm, has engaged in this scientific debate as well, has attended workshops in Iceland. Their focus is on Greenland and the Greenlandic ice sheet, but they talk about technology that is tested and trialed there, then being brought into the Antarctic as well, because of the West Antarctic ice sheet being very important, and its collapse would be serious. So doing something about that is urgent. Okay, so it's not just novelists and engineering firms who have started thinking about these things. I have brought you two very recent news articles, one from The Guardian, which is a major international journalism outlet, and Nature, which is a major scientific outlet. And this is not a peer-reviewed article, but it's a news item that Nature writers have written about. And this first piece is from January this year, and the other piece is from a couple of weeks ago. So the idea here, it's just an idea But what the point that I want to make is it's gaining traction, and it's not just a debate that is happening in some peer-reviewed science papers, but it's also happening in novels, in the minds of engineers, and in international journalism of the highest order. So that leads me to conclude in a way that this is important, and I think we should think about that as well. It's a fantastic idea, but it's not in that niche where it started any longer. It's gaining traction. That's my kind of motivation, why I would like to think more about what that means with regard to the governance aspects. Okay, because I've told you about the current emissions pathways. I've told you about the fragility of these critical glaciers for the Greenlandic and Western Arctic ice sheet stability. And I do think it's not totally implausible that at some point in the near future, someone will raise such a fantastical idea in the Antarctic context, whether that is a science consortium that wants to initiate a glacial geoengineering experiment in the Antarctic, or it's a political idea put forward by an Antarctic Treaty Consultative Party meeting. I'm not saying it's realistic and it's going to happen. I'm just saying it's not totally implausible that it will happen at some point in the future. Or also, I think we should not totally disregard that. We could also see some private sector philanthropic initiatives. So Bill Gates, for example, the millionaire, is pursuing solar geoengineering ideas quite a bit. At that point, let me say that I'm aware that there are other geoengineering ideas. So like solar radiation management, for example, is one that attracts the most attention in media as well as scholarly for good reason. Carbon dioxide removal technologies are also talked about, and you see both of them discussed in IPCC reports, for example. This is not. Okay, this is much more niche. But for us who work on the Antarctic, I think this is something that we should have on our radar, because this is unique to the Antarctic and Greenland as well. If you would like to establish anything like that in order to mitigate the effects of sea level rise, you'd have to do it in Greenland or the Antarctic. And if we are not paying attention, no one will, basically, is my point as well. So for that moment, that may not come, that this is raised politically, I think there needs to be a more robust interdisciplinary debate around the feasibility as well as the desirability and the conflict potentials of such a technology in the Antarctic context. As you can imagine, these proposals have attracted a lot of criticism with regard to their feasibility. This is not technically possible. You can't do this, right? It is incredibly expensive. So the proponents themselves, John Moore, who's very much leading this whole initiative with collaborators at the University of Cambridge and Stanford University, says that this costs around 40 to 80 billion US dollars to set it up, and then 1 to 2 billion a year to keep it going for a long time, because if you initiate that, you'd have to really build it and then keep it in place for decades, if not centuries. Okay, so this is a big undertaking. Again, this is unprecedented scale. There was a lot of criticism with regard to environmental impacts that something like that might have, like the flow of nutrients, all of that. Again, I'm not an environmentalist, an environmental scientist. I cannot make that assessment. Okay, this is not what I'm here for. Another key point is about desirability. Should we even put an infrastructure like that into the Antarctic? Should we? There are different arguments around moral hazard. It might distract us from important mitigation efforts if we embark on this geoengineering route. There is a widespread skepticism that technical fixes such as that, usually on the back of some very potent companies that can actually realize something like that, so is a form of capitalism, and that should be not the way forward. That's the argument. I'm not saying it's my argument. I'm just saying that argument exists. This is not the way forward to deal with the climate crisis that we're in. Again, I'm not talking about that desirability either. I don't think that I'm in a position to make that judgment. But at some point in the future, that point may not come. But if it comes, I'd like to have a robust discussion from different disciplines that looks at all the pros and cons. And I think in that I can play a role as a political scientist working on Arctic geopolitics, coming from a Peace Research Institute, because what I would like to focus on are these conflict potentials. Okay, so if you put an infrastructure like that into the Antarctic, or you think about doing that, or you propose doing that, what does that mean for Arctic geopolitics? That's what I'm thinking about, and that's what I would like to further expand here now. Okay, because this is that most recent paper. I've referenced it a couple of times earlier by Kiefer et al., less than a year old. The very last sentence of this paper, where they showed all these different designs and the maps where you could put this. The very last sentence is this: the hundreds of years commitment to maintenance and long-term governance of sea level rise management means that governance, funding, and social license must go far beyond the 29 consultative parties to the Antarctic Treaty System. So that's the very last sentence. And that's, for me, the first sentence where my starting things, because that is revolutionary, right? Like if you put an infrastructure like that in the Antarctic Treaty System is basically not built for it. And you have to go beyond it. So that, to me, at least raises the question, what are the governance risks to the Antarctic Treaty System stemming from such an idea? That's the question that I would like to further think about with you today. And I do that against the backdrop, and I do that very briefly, okay? I'm working on a paper about this together with Akiho Shibata, and the generous grant that brought me here to Kobe allowed me to spend my time and my thinking powers on this. So there will be a paper sooner than later, and you can look in this more in depth. And there are some legal questions that are relevant that Akiho will delve on more later on as well. But I just want to briefly tell you what that governance discourse so far looks, and then I will add where I see those understated risks. Okay, so this was that first paper in 2018, where Mu et al. In Nature, for the first time, proposed this idea, and it immediately got some received some flack from some international lawyers based in Tasmania, in Australia, where they pointed to some important gaps here in that proposal, because there was little consideration of the legal implications of how this would be realized with the environmental protocol in place. And they have this, and I plucked that out as a quote, this statement, this claim that I think still holds true: any discussion of geoengineering in Antarctica needs to preserve and strengthen Arctic governance, not weaken it. This is a task for international lawyers and policymakers as well as scientists. And I would add for political scientists as well. So this is my starting point here. So from the beginning, I would say this governance dimension was a bit lacking in that debate. By the proponents of this idea. So governance dimensions were not elaborated enough on. It's not just me feeling that, but others as well. If I now look at that literature 5 years later, there are literature reviews written about glacial geoengineering in the Antarctic. That's that first one, Minuno, that is not addressing governance risks at all. There's not a single word spent on it about the risks of something like that in the Antarctic. I think that is a problem. I think we have to talk about that, as hard as that is, because it's a fictional proposal, right? It doesn't exist yet. And others, Moore et al. In 2021, kind of overplay the potential for these cryosphere interventions to find the political recognition within the ATS. They say, well, we propose this and we call it ice sheet conservation. And this is, show you that on the next slide. This is what is the aims of the treaty, and that's why this is going to happen. And this is just a selection, these are examples. Another paper that is extensively engaging with governance questions to be fair, is Corbett and Parson in 2022. But in my view, they understate the political risks and the legal complexities that glacial geoengineering in the form of an undersea curtain would mean in context of the Antarctic. So just very briefly, okay? That Moore paper, they argue that conservation of the ice sheet is something that would be consistent with the aims of the treaty. They ask this kind of rhetorical, suggestive question: why would Antarctic Treaty consultative parties deny ice sheet conservation? Which is odd to frame it like that, I think, but it shows you that they're trying to make the case why this is the ethical case why this is important, and Antarctic Treaty consultative parties should do something like that. They raise that such an undersea curtain financed by ATCPs, the 29, who most of them are high emitters, but also very rich polar research undertaking nations. It would be a good way for those ATCPs to do the right thing and the equitable thing of protecting low-lying coastal communities around the world, Pacific island nation states who face existential threat from ice sheet collapse and rising seas. So they propose, that's their claim, that this would be an equitable way of dealing with that problem. And overall, they think, and this is, I think, the last sentence again of their paper, they say that these kind of interventions, glacial geoengineering interventions, are legally and ethically justified. It's a very positive, in a way, biased way of looking at governance issues. That other paper, Corbett and Parson, calls glacial geoengineering a form of radical adaptation. They too argue that, yes, this can be enabled by the Antarctic Treaty System, but only after the Antarctic Treaty System has transformed itself quite dramatically and drastically, and does look indeed very different than it does today. They suggest the reinterpretation of core norms within the Antarctic regime. They concede that the environmental protocol as it stands today would probably prohibit construction, but they leave it open, and I'm not going into that, what the science, what the research about that would mean, whether the science could go ahead or not under the protocol. They also recommend to avoid raising the issue at all, because of knowing that it is a politically contentious issue. And in the end, they make this statement. And again, I'm as a geopolitics scholar, I find this curious, and I would like to learn more about that. But they don't offer any explanation for why they come to the conclusion that geopolitical and security interests may make states more willing than is now evident to explore ice sheet stabilization and amend the Antarctic Treaty System accordingly. So unfortunately, there's no explanation why they think that is the case. And also the counter example is not really a given, like where are the risks? So they really just look at the positives and try to make a case for glacial geoengineering. And I think regardless of how you stand to that, and I'm probably, in addition to some certain skepticism, I'm still agnostic. I would like to know more about this and what it means. But we should look at all the factors and not just the ones that serve our purpose. And it's a bit selective. I would also like to make just a quick nod to my discipline, international relations, because for most geoengineering governance research that exists, most of it about solar radiation management, McLaren and Corey have said that there's a tendency in those proposals for geoengineering to underplay the international fragmentation of world politics and its histories. And there's an assumption about a best case assumption about cooperation, and that states will cooperate on these issues. And they say that it's important in those proposals to really look into it, what the historical and geopolitical context is of these proposals. And I think the Antarctic is very interesting in that regard, because the Antarctic Treaty System is often held up as this role model for international cooperation, right? And you'd think on the face of it, well, if there is a place in the world where you can find the cooperation a spirit of cooperation to make this happen is probably in the Antarctic, right? But I think that would be dangerous to assume, and really need to look deeper into the geopolitical fault lines that exist in the Antarctic treaty system already and have existed for quite a while, to more critically discuss what such proposals would mean in context of the Antarctic treaty system. So let me get to that understated governance risks. The first one that I would raise is about authority. Who is making these decisions about whether to build such a curtain or not? Who has the authority? And I understand authority here as, again, I'm not a legal scholar, as legitimacy and capability coming together. Who has the authority to lock in these intergenerational decisions? If you decide to put this there, it has to be kept there for generations, for centuries. Who has the authority to do that? Can those 29 Antarctic Treaty consultative parties legitimately claim to act on behalf of humankind or international community? This was a key question in the 1980s when we had the discussions around CREMRA, the regulated mining issue in the Antarctic. Malaysia raised around that time the question of Antarctica in the context of the General Assembly, the United Nations General Assembly, where they stated that those self-selecting few rich nations, often with imperial pasts, are not the ones who can legitimately claim that they act with regard to this common heritage of mankind. It should really be the United Nations that manages the Antarctic as a common heritage of mankind. So we had that in the past, and I don't think it's implausible to see that come up again in a form of question of Antarctica here, because of that threat that is coming from the ice sheets, and that then manifests in sea level rise. A colleague of ours, Peter Roberts, has written about that, where he raised the question whether those communities most affected by sea level rise might also want to have something to say about Antarctic matters in general, but also about something like glacial geoengineering. So maybe it's not the traditional Antarctic powers who should make these decisions, but maybe it should be Pacific Island states. Pacific Islanders on the Marshall Islands, on Vanuatu, or in the Indian Ocean who make the decision, right? So that it raises all sorts of authority questions. That's my point. And we can't just gloss over them. We need to look deeper into those authority questions, because there's a risk for conflict here. Second, and when we talk about Antarctic geopolitics, sovereignty is never far, right? I mean, to this room here, I do not have to explain that too much, but the question of who funds and builds and maintains these infrastructures that have an unprecedented scale matters, okay? Yes, sovereignty is put aside, basically, according to Article 4, but it's still there, and it informs decision-making, especially with regard to claimant states. Where is research infrastructure put? Where is it not? That matters, especially when you build infrastructure, which is there to last, right? You might want to build infrastructure that is meant to last, because you do not believe that an agreement that has been very successful for over 60 years will necessarily be in place for another 60 years. Having that infrastructure somewhere allows you to project power, strategic power, but also political power. Okay, that is important. And sovereignty plays a role here, not only in terms of there are state actors who claim territorial sovereignty over a certain slice of the Antarctic. That is one way of looking at it. But those, I'm sure you in the room know that the Amundsen sector that I showed you earlier isn't claimed by anyone, right? But that doesn't make the problem of sovereignty go away, because in my view, the problem of sovereignty is that it's not there. It's the main organizing principle for international affairs and law, and it's not in place. And that matters, regardless of whether that specific slice is claimed by anyone or not. In the best case scenario, you would hope, in order to get around these niggly geostrategic sovereignty considerations, that you'd have the support of all Antarctic Treaty Consultative Parties, at least, and a great international collaborative effort that puts that glacial geoengineering infrastructure into the Amundsen Sea, right? In Antarctic history, we have, with one exception, but I get to that in a second, not seen any single internationally planned, built, and managed research station in the Antarctic. And this is just research. We have the Concordia station, right, that is kind of shared by France and Italy. But these are EU partners. Given the state of world affairs that we're in and the growing strategic competition, I cannot see, I'm not saying it's totally impossible. I'm just saying it's not very likely to bank on that in those proposals, that this is going to happen as a large international cooperative effort easily. Okay, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying it would be a fantastic diplomatic feat if that can be achieved. And finally, and that really is a point that doesn't exist in that governance literature to this point, is security concerns. Because if you put that infrastructure into the Antarctic, and I think we can consider it a piece of critical infrastructure, if it helps us to mitigate the effects of sea level rise, which coastal communities, the global economy really rests on. Like, think about all those port cities that are running the world economy are threatened by sea level rise or not because of that installation being in place. This is critical infrastructure, and you have to secure it somehow, right? Because we have seen that, unfortunately, the Russo-Ukrainian war, critical infrastructure such as dams or nuclear power plants have been targeted in war, for example. But we can also, and I'm getting into, this is speculation or conjecture, but this is just teasing out the potentials, right? And I think this is not totally implausible, so that we can just totally disregard it. You can think about green finger, this is what it's called, in a most recent paper by Severcool, who looks at the weaponization of geoengineering, green finger scenarios where rich individuals or groups become active in some form or the other, either against or for glacial geoengineering, who have an interest in sabotaging this, right? If you say, well, yes, there is this security risk, then you get into that securitizing move, and you have to think about, how do I protect this? And then the problems, I think, start. Who is projecting that power into the Antarctic? That is unprecedented. And then a final example that I would like to raise is also, when you think about the scale of this undertaking, who is going to build this? Which nation state has the public works capability to put something like that into the Amundsen Sea? Are we not talking about big engineering firms actually pulling this off? And do we then have policemen protecting them, or do we have security contractors in the Antarctic? Like, these are questions that we have to think about, and there are legal implications of that, I'm sure, that go beyond my expertise, but I'm sure we have the experts in the room who have at least some thoughts about that. Okay, but that all just simply leads me to the conclusion, and this is the end of the presentation as well, that these risks that I have just, or these challenges with regard to authority, sovereignty, and security taken together, lead me to the conclusion that there is a not implausible, maybe even significant potential for international discord here that we should not disregard. And international discord is what we do not want, according to formal and informal rules, happen in the Antarctic, because we have this peaceful purpose provision in Article 1. That is what Antarctica is there for. So we should be careful how we discuss ideas that might be good or not, that we, in terms of infrastructure that we put there, if we know already that there are considerable risks with regard to international discord. Thank you very much for your attention. Arigato gozaimasu.
Physical Oceanography. Okay, so he's a natural scientist, and we are very happy to have you here, Shigeru, today. And thank you for your comments today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shibata Sensei. Hello, everyone. My name is Shigeru Aoki. I'm a physical oceanographer, so I'm not on top of the glaciology nor the engineering. So my comments will not be very straight on these issues, but kind of a more general. And as Patrick introduced, I actually agree that ice sheets are already affected or somehow so much affected by the anthropogenic forces somehow, and they are no longer near the sacred or untouchable places, the Antarctica and Greenland ice sheets. So the basic ideas of those geoengineering, glaciological geoengineering, most of the ideas seems to be reasonable in principle. So I guess the question would be the matter of feasibility, consequences and impacts, and the other resources or energy we will need. And as an oceanographer, I personally feel that the deeper ocean curtains stuff is, well, deep polar oceans are not very easy place to cope with, as they say, actually. Ocean deeper than 100 meters is, I think, to my experience, it's a different phrase for the shallow waters, like 20 meters, 30 meters or something. So even for that far away polar ice jump back ice places are actually, I think it's very difficult place to work on. And for the other, each implementation will have further larger reach or consequences. For example, for the warm water curtain, it will not just affect the other melt ice shelf from underneath, but that meltwater flow drift will also affect the downstream bottom water formation. So that will end up in the environmental impact as well. So that might be, in a way, that might be a good to keep the bottom water formation at this level, at the present level. The bottom water is also said to be a weak bottom water formation in Antarctica is said to be a weakening now. So it's might be good to keep the bottom water formation at this level. But the maneuver would be very subtle. So if you would stop the meltwater completely, that would enhance the bottom water formation further than now. So that might introduce the too positive impact for the other bottom water formation. So that sort of far reach would need a very subtle maneuver subtle maneuver to set in the range of ideal range. And my biggest concern is at the point that these glaciological engineerings do not mitigate the global warming in principle. So rather enhance the overall global warming. So they need new materials to be introduced and transportation, fuels, etc., etc. As they might mitigate the sea level rise, but they will cause the other global warming issues. The more heat will accumulate elsewhere, actually. So So someone else would need to cope with that problem as well. So there are discussions of cost, some discussions about cost, but well, not much about the timing, amount and timing of emissions of greenhouse gas, where and when they are implemented. They should be implemented. So comparisons that like the little more emissions now are better than the larger emissions in the far future might be somewhat odd, sounds somewhat odd to me, given the situation that we need to cut the greenhouse gas emissions now. So the very wide and detailed budget calculations are needed. So to conclude my brief comment, broad scientific and technological discussions are needed for sure, and our knowledge is still still insufficient. And moreover, a broader social communication will be needed, and that will be the issues of Patrick and Shibata senses, probably. So not just for the other polar communities, but all over the worldwide communities. Although I'm not sure how I can implement that sort of a kind of a discussion table. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so thank you very much. And I have a few slides because not fancy slides like Patrick's, but I need to speak fast because I want to speak a lot of things. So that's why, in order to assist you, I have made some keywords on the slide. So that's for that purpose. Thank you very much. So again, Professor of International Law at Kobe University. Thank you very much for this occasion. So I think I don't need to go through this, and I think Patrick and I are on the same page that this idea is still a fantastic idea, and we are discussing on the assumption that if this kind of things would happen into the future. But also at this moment, I think I should point out that the lawyers, maybe unlike a political scientist, we, the lawyers, try to solve the problem rather than create them. And we have to be very careful as lawyers that what are the problems and what are the facts about the problems and whether the law, today's law, can solve them. And my presentation is, comments is based on that perspective. Thank you. So from that point of view, so from lawyers' perspective, it is more appropriate to consider the idea of glacial engineering in phases, focusing more on specific and concrete activities that would potentially be undertaken in the Antarctic. I propose the following 5 phases. Now, number 1, a science phase, 2, a data analysis and computer modeling phase, 3, logistics phase, 4, the field experiments phase, and finally, the 5, project development phase. And I have quoted a few words from the proponents relevant to each of those phases. But let me just mention the 4th one. The proponents propose those experiments would start from Greenland, and the lessons learned from Greenlandic glaciers could then be applied to the more difficult glaciers in Antarctica, which such as the Totten and Pine Island and the Thwaites, those 2 last glaciers that Patrick has mentioned. But this, according to this paper, Totten is mentioned. And of course, for Japanese scientists, I think it's important that Totten is considered as a possible place for application of this new technology, because Totten Glacier is the current focus of the Japanese Antarctic expedition research, and Professor Aoki has been there and actually observing the Totten glaciers. This is frozen. Okay, okay. Sorry. Okay, thank you very much. So then, what are the legal issues potentially raised by the proponents' arguments for glacial engineering, which may require more thorough legal analysis? And so due to my time constraints, I will indicate only three of them. The first is the purpose of the scientific activity in the Antarctic. And the second is the transparency required in the exercise of freedom of scientific research in Antarctica. The third is the role of SCA as the official and authoritative advisory body to the Antarctic Treaty System. I'll focus on the first two issues. So the issue of the purpose of the scientific research in the Antarctic revolves around a recurring question whether international law generally and Antarctic law more specifically can or should differentiate one scientific activity from another by the intended future use of, for example, samples, knowledge, and/or data obtained from such scientific activities. The proponents of glacial engineering, like Corbett and Person, 2022, says the initial phase of scientific research on West Antarctica ice sheet could serve both aims of the geoengineering research and basic cryosphere science. So in the context of Antarctic governance, this kind of argument is actually a thorny legal question and reminds us of the discussion relating to and the governance difficulties in addressing the bioprospecting activity in Antarctica. Since the proposed glacial geoengineering science, as you have seen from Patrick's slides, may also be undertaken in the ocean, a similar legal issue under the law of the sea could be raised. In this regard, the 2013 amendment on marine engineering activities to the London dumping regime may bring some insights to the potential differentiation of scientific research based on its purpose. 2013 amendment on marine engineering prohibits placing a matter into the sea from the vessels or platforms for marine geoengineering activity listed in Annex 4, and under Annex 4, currently the ocean fertilization is listed. And the amendment allows, under a permit, only a ocean fertilization activity that can be considered as, I quote, constituting legitimate scientific research. And Annex 5 of the amendment provides some criteria for such legitimate scientific research, emphasizing its purpose as adding scientific knowledge, scientific methods, and peer-reviewed publications. Okay. No. Okay, so this is it. The second potential legal issue arising from Antarctic glacial geoengineering is how much of the transparency is required in the exercise of freedom of scientific investigation under the Antarctic Treaty and/or the freedom of marine scientific research under the law of the sea. The effectiveness of the Antarctic governance is fundamentally premised on the principles of transparency, peer review, and the good faith of those nations and scientists who have the capacities as well as the consequent special responsibilities in safeguarding the international public values of Antarctica enunciated in the Antarctic Treaty and its protocol, namely peace, science, and environmental protection. To implement those principles, the transparency mechanisms are built into the Antarctic Treaty System, such as the information exchange obligations under Article 7.5 and Article 3.1, the inspection regime under Article 7.1 to 4, and the review process of those information in the Committee on Environmental Protection, CEP, and the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, ATCM. So under Annex 1 of the Madrid Protocol on Environmental Impact Assessment, EIA, among others, the purpose of the proposed activity must be clearly stated in the IEE, the Initial Environmental Evaluation, and CEE, the Comprehensive Environmental Evaluation. So these transparency mechanisms apply in full to the Antarctic scientific research. So the aim of the scientific research to obtain data for future glacial geoengineering projects, even when such research in its appearance is similar to basic cryosphere research, should not be hidden when its IEE and CEE are to be prepared and reviewed by the CEP and ATCM. A suggestion for a kind of secrecy in some of the proponents' argument, whatever their rationale, is a matter of a serious concern in the context of the governance under the ATS. It should, however, be noted that there are some legal controversies as to the interpretation of Article 6 of the Antarctic Treaty, which provides that nothing in the treaty shall prejudice the exercise of high seas freedom under international law. The marine scientific research is indeed one of those freedoms, and if a glacial geoengineering research is conducted entirely in the ocean, particularly in Antarctic seas of the coastal areas where there are no claims made, which are the case for the Pine Islands and the Swites, an argument could be made that such marine scientific research in areas beyond national jurisdiction should only be bound by the UNCLOS-related regulations. And currently, as you know, under UNCLOS, except for some mineral-related activities in the seabed, only very general obligations on marine and environmental protection apply, unless the new BBNJ agreement enters into force and become binding on those conducting such research in the Antarctica. So again, an argument to abuse such a legal loophole in the transparency mechanisms established by the Antarctic Treaty System is a serious concern. Okay, thank you. So this is my final slide. So finally, in evaluating the legitimacy of the scientific research relating to glacial geoengineering, as well as in implementing the scientific transparency in the process of planning and preparing a glacial geoengineering research, the role of Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research is SCAR, being a legitimate scientific advisory body to the CEP and ATCM would be extremely important. And currently, SCAR's interdisciplinary research program called INSTANT, this one, according to my view, I don't know whether Professor Aoki agrees, but according to my view, it would be well situated to look into any of the future ideas on glacial geoengineering research. So thank you very much for my comments to Patrick. Thank you.